October 27, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis reached its climax in the deep waters of the Sargasso Sea. Here, a U.S. Navy anti-submarine blockade cornered a Soviet vessel under cover of darkness. Popular history records a specific sequence. A trapped, suffocating, and panicked Soviet submarine captain believed World War III had begun and ordered a nuclear strike against the American warships above. This narrative credits a single man with stopping the launch. Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet officer with veto power, is said to have calmly talked the captain down. In the decades since, Arkhipov has been immortalized in documentaries and prestigious awards as the man who saved the world. However, a detailed analysis of the event, cross-referenced with declassified U.S. Navy deck logs and Soviet operational constraints, reveals major fractures in this dramatic account. Systemic command and control protocols and strict physical constraints prevented nuclear war. These structural barriers proved more decisive than any individual veto. Accepting the myth of a lone hero obscures the reality of military systems engineering. The Cold War was survived through intentional, unyielding bureaucratic friction. The encounter involved the B-59, a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, surrounded by a U.S. Navy hunter-killer task force. Years later, Soviet crew members testified that they endured hours of relentless, lethal depth-charge attacks from the American destroyers. Retrospective accounts claim this sustained barrage broke Captain Valentin Savitsky's resolve, prompting his order to ready the nuclear torpedo. The empirical operational data suggests a different sequence. 3 days prior, the U.S. Naval Oceanographic Office transmitted a global notice to mariners, NOTMAR 4562. The NOTMAR established a strict identification procedure using non-lethal practice depth charges. These were acoustic pings designed to signal submerged submarines to surface on an easterly course. Declassified deck logs from the USS Beale and USS Coney confirm that the destroyers followed this protocol, dropping precise sequences of 5 practice grenades. These caused loud noise without physical damage. The timeline fails to support an immediate blind panic. The B-59 waited more than 3 hours after the final practice grenade before surfacing at 8:52 p.m. Depleted batteries and high CO2 levels dictated the surfacing. These mechanical and biological necessities drove the decision-making. The primary trigger for the rogue submarine myth, an unprovoked lethal attack, appears to be a standard acoustic signaling procedure distorted by the crew's confinement. Even if Captain Savitsky issued a frantic order to ready the nuclear torpedo, the physical and procedural requirements for execution remained in place. Inside a cramped, severely overheated Foxtrot submarine, launching a nuclear weapon required more than a single command. The Soviet triple-key authorization protocol was engineered to prevent rogue actions. A captain's launch order could not bypass executive officer Vasily Arkhipov. Finally, political officer Ivan Maslenikov provided a third mandatory block. Without their simultaneous consensus, the system remained completely stalled. This redundant chain of command closely mirrored the permissive action links used by the United States. Both systems forced a consensus delay, buying time for rationality during periods of high tension. Beyond procedural rules, the single nuclear warhead on board was constantly guarded by a specialized intelligence officer from the Soviet 6th Department. This warhead was stored separately from the conventional torpedo body. Mating the two components required a complex, time-consuming physical assembly at sea. There is no operational evidence that the 6th Department Guard received an order to surrender the warhead, nor that any crew member began the assembly process. The architectural friction of procedure and physics neutralized the possibility of a panic launch. The command and control system worked as engineered. Most claims of aggression occurred after 8:52 p.m., once the B-59 surfaced to recharge its batteries. In 1997, Arkhipov claimed that U.S. aircraft flew over the submarine and fired over 300 cannon shells at the exposed vessel. Other Soviet officers later supported this, recalling machine gun tracer fire and a roar of cannonade that drowned out voice communications. When we contrast these memories with the official U.S. Navy logs and the specific aircraft deployed, a physical impossibility emerges. The primary aircraft orbiting the submarine were Grumman S-2F-3 trackers from the USS Randolph. The S-2F-3 trackers deployed during the quarantine lacked cannons and machine guns. They physically lacked the hardware to perform the strafing run described by the Soviet crew. Narrative logs filed by the U.S. pilots document their actual actions. They were performing close visual surveillance. Because of the darkness and poor weather, the aircraft dropped photoelectric flares to illuminate the submarine for photography. These flares ignite with loud, concussive pops and produce white flashes. To a crew suffering from heat stroke and sleep deprivation, this acoustic and visual shock was easily misinterpreted as incoming gunfire. Environmental trauma distorts human memory. What the logs recorded as aerial photography, the crew remembered as a lethal attack. This leaves the final claim. In response to the perceived air attack, the B-59 wheeled its open forward torpedo tubes directly at the USS Connie. The physical positioning of the two vessels dictates the reality of this standoff. The ships were running on a parallel easterly course, moving slowly, separated by a distance of 100 yards. A Soviet nuclear torpedo has a minimum arming distance. Firing it creates an indiscriminate blast radius. Detonating a nuclear warhead at a range of 300 feet would vaporize the target and the submarine that fired it simultaneously. The USS Connie sat within the torpedo's dead zone. Launching a nuclear weapon at point-blank range would result in immediate tactical suicide. Turning the submarine toward the destroyer was a conventional intimidation tactic, rather than a viable preparation for a nuclear strike. Both sets of officers understood the physics of their weapons. This shared professional restraint negated the possibility of a launch, stripping away the illusion of a hair-trigger apocalypse. When the cultural memory of October 27th is aligned with operational data, the romanticized narrative of a single man preventing Armageddon loses its weight. Systemic military design, specifically non-lethal signaling, multi-key protocols, and spatial constraints, kept the peace on October 27th. These three layers of deterrence successfully managed the crisis. The peace was kept by the intentionally designed friction of military bureaucracy. The reality of the standoff was governed by systems engineering, despite the cultural preference for simple narratives of solitary heroes. Cold War command structures were built to force a non-event, heavily weighting the scales toward inaction, even under psychological pressure. Surviving the nuclear age depends on maintaining these engineered systemic safeguards.